All right, good morning, everyone. We're going to move on into the second lecture on the abolition of man, and I am largely going to skip over the second chapter. Not because it's not worth attention, but because I have two lectures and there's so much substance in the third that I really need to focus in on it. And what the second does, which I do encourage you to read, and I thought it was very helpful when I first read it, is to establish the commonality between the major religions on what Lewis described in the first chapter as the chest. So that thumos, that spirited element, to use Aristotle's phrase, that all religions regard as an important thing, about being a moral individual. I mean, you often hear in Christian circles that Christianity is not a form of moralism, and that's true. It's a work of grace, and it's not moral achievement, but nonetheless it has features about living a moral life and so forth, and it has those in common with religions. And Christianity is a religion, by the way, in case you haven't heard, because it's sometimes asserted that Christianity is not a religion. But it says in Scripture that, in fact, that it is a religion. And that religion just means that it's religion in Latin. The religio is something bound. It's something that is tied to something. And the something that it's tied to, one of the things I would submit to you is the idea of a moral human nature. Because that's what we bear in Imago Dei. God himself is good. He has a nature, and we who are made in his image are bound by that, and that has certain consequences, which Scripture lays out. That phrase that man is made in the image of God is asserted, Genesis 1:26, 27, but it's not really fleshed out too much, other than that Adam and Eve together bear that nature, and the two together are also the first family. So it's the fundamental social unit as well. And they're called to exercise dominion over the earth. And they're called to obey God. So there's all sorts of things implicit in that give us some clues about what bearing the Imago Dei entails. It takes the whole of Scripture to flesh those out. And I'm not going to go into that here, other than to say that very briefly, Adam and Eve are made in Imago Dei, whereas Jesus is the Imago Dei. Right? Colossians 1:15. He is the image of the invisible God, whereas we are made in the image of God. So if we want to see who we are, what our moral character is to be like, and other things, we look to Christ. With all that said, we're going to come to the abolition of man. And the abolition of man, of course, is not the abolition of life, despite what, and actually even Skinner doesn't think it is. He's quite clear, and I mentioned this in his book last time, when he's talking about the abolition of man and the destruction, he's not talking about the destruction of the human race. That's actually Skinner's fear. It's not Lewis's fear. Lewis is not worried about the apocalyptic visions of a total annihilation of all of life. Those, on the other hand, are actually there in the theories of the conditioners. But I'm going to come to that in a minute. So evolutionism and scientism and the portraits that we see in the sci-fi of his day, H.G. Wells and so forth. So in The Time Machine, he is transported to a future in which life has been obliterated on planet Earth. If you think that's not uncommon. A lot of apocalyptic literature has the same sort of thing. Earth's been hit by a nuclear war and there's no one left. There's a few scattered survivors. That's very common in science fiction. And it goes back as far as, by the way, Lord Byron's Cain, early 19th century. It's part and parcel with Romanticism. So next year, I think I'm looking at the Romantic epic, and we'll note that many of the features of what we think are contemporary science fiction theories exist before science fiction as a genre. And they actually predate Darwinism. but they anticipate it. And so I think that idea of life, which we think is relatively new, dates back even before Darwin. And my theory, which I've presented in a lecture, and I'll connect the lecture when I record this, I'll put a link to it. My theory on this is that the myth of Darwinism precedes the scientific theory, which we call Darwinism, which means it questions the credibility of Darwinism as a scientific viewpoint. But we'll get to that when we get to it. Where shall I begin here? Because it's so much here. I'll begin with this. So last time I quoted B.F. Skinner, Beyond Freedom and Dignity, and talked about Lewis as the defender of that view, which is the defender of man as having a free will and a moral conscience and a dignity that distinguished him from the animal world and from the rest of creation, and having responsibility and so forth. These were presented in the role models that are at the heart of our notion of heroism. This is what literature teaches. It's also what Scripture talks about. There are models of conduct, good and ill, for us to emulate. Skinner wants to get beyond that because he wants to get to a view where we're in control of things, where we can condition it, we can bring it under our dominion. Here's another more contemporary writer. His name is Theodore Dalrymple. It's a pseudonym. I think his name's Anthony Daniels. He's a British psychologist. Very interesting man. I encourage you to read him. I think he's excellent. The title of the book is Admirable Evasions: How Psychology Undermines Morality. I'm just going to read the preface, and I'll make a brief comment. Have you ever heard the word Schadenfreude? It's not an English word. It's a German word, of course. In German, they have a little saying, Schadenfreude ist die beste Freude, which is the delight in others' harm is the best delight. You might say it's perverse for German. It's the Germans, of course. What would the Germans say? The Germans are perverse. Here's the quote from Daniels' preface. In The Misfortune of Our Friends, wrote the Duc de la Rochefoucauld nearly 3.5 centuries ago, there's something not entirely unpleasing. When we read this for the first time, we experience both a shock and a sense of recognition. Something discreditable about us has been put into words that, if we had reflected a little harder or more honestly upon ourselves, we should have known all along. And henceforth we shall never be able to pretend that we are other than complex and contradictory beings. La Rochefoucauld was able to put into words what anyone could have known by, quote, attending to the motions of his own mind, as Dr. Johnson put it. And then he asks, have human beings progressed beyond this in their self-understanding? It is my contention that they have not, and that our vaunted or pretended progress, amazing though it may be from a technological point of view, is actually a retrogression in honesty and sophistication. Psychology is not a key to self-understanding, but a cultural barrier to such understanding as we can achieve. But it is my belief that we shall never be able entirely to pluck out the heart of our mystery. Of this I am glad rather than sorry. So the problem that I mentioned last time is the human heart. And these two impulses, this capacity for noble action, of grandeur, of self-sacrifice, extraordinary courage, genuine humility, these virtues, these things that we saw last time in Aristotle's portrait were part of the allegory of the chariot. On the other hand, there's the black beast, which has the exact opposite, the worst depravity, the delight in others' harm, even our friends. That's also true of human nature. So both of them are enough to make us think about what's going on. And Lewis is aware of these things, and he's seen depravity. Remember, the Second World War was going on. He saw the First World War as well, which is a horrific scene. Millions going into battle for reasons that were not entirely clear and dying in the trenches, senselessly, gassed. He was at Oxford at the time. He was called up to battle, as was Tolkien. He saw his best friends die beside him for no apparent reason. Nothing was gained by that war. And then 20 years on, they went at it again, the Western powers. Lewis has questions about this, and he thinks that in many ways they're characteristic of the age, not accidental. They come with this attempt to control life and to master it. It's a theme also in Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, as you know. The desire for dominion over all of life, which marks Sauron the Great, but also the creatures that he gives rings to. They're moved by power, this lust for power, and the idea of dominating all of life. Now, that idea of dominating all of life has an origin. So this is Richard M. Weaver's Ideas Have Consequences. I'm just going to read a little extract. Don't worry, I'm getting to Lewis. This is page 5, the introduction. So it used to be in science, in the medieval period, that science was to observe the world and to glorify God in the observation of it. But that was the purpose of science, was to understand the world as God had created and take delight in it, but to simply observe and understand. But come Francis Bacon in the early 17th century, that shifted. The Baconian sciences turned science into something over where we no longer observe nature as a part of nature, but we seek power over nature. And here's his quote. The question of what the world was made for now becomes meaningless, because the asking of it presupposes something prior to nature in the order of existence. In other words, it presupposes God. What was the world created for? Well, let's really push it back to theology. What's God made the world for? That's implicit in the medieval worldview, the discarded image that we're going to come to next class. But come Baconian science, it is not the mysterious fact of the world's existence which interests the new man, but explanations of how the world works, the instrumental cause, not the initial cause, who made the world as it is, why did he make it, but rather, what's it like, how is it made, what's the features of it. And the purpose of asking the question how the world works rather than why the world works the way it does, he says, this is the rational basis for modern science, whose systematization of phenomena is, as Bacon declared in the New Atlantis, a means to dominion. Now, that word dominion is a Christian word. It's the charge to Adam and Eve to exercise dominion over the earth, to fill and subdue it. Right? They're to have children, and they're to bring it under dominion. There's a moral mandate there as well. They're to take care. They're to be good stewards. After the fall, the word dominion gives way to domination. What's the difference? Some people think that exercising dominion is ipso facto domination. The best way we can eradicate the problem of dominion is simply to cease to exist. That's why people don't have children anymore, one of the reasons. They're going to take action against this human depravity and this lust for power. I think the difference is that dominion has a moral nature. It recognizes things as God has made them. Recognize that the dominion mandate exists before the fall. It's a good thing. It's not inherently bad. But domination over life is what characterizes modern science. And in his introduction to literature of the 16th century, excluding drama, Lewis notes, and this is going from memory, and it's not an exact quote, but he notes that magic is not characteristic of the medieval period. He notes that it arises concurrent with the rise of modern science. So it's not in the 16th century, let alone the 15th, 14th, and earlier. It arises at the same time as the interest in modern science does. That in itself is interesting, just in terms of observation. And you wouldn't expect it. If modern science is about looking at things clearly and rationally and empirical justification, we can corroborate all things, why the sudden uptick in and return to an interest in magic, which characterizes the ancient pagan world? Right? So it's in some ways, while getting rid of belief in religion, although it doesn't do that, modern scientists are Christians. At the same time, it is trying to gain power over nature, and it's interested in the how, not the why things are as they are. And because of that, there's an element of, and I think it's to some degree, the scientists are blind to this, but it's really about the growth in their power over nature. Now, they use it for human betterment. The science is going to be there to better the human condition, which is no bad thing because of the fall. It's not a bad thing to understand why God made things as they are and how he made them as they are. So there's nothing wrong with science per se, and Lewis certainly doesn't think that there is. And on the contrary, he thinks that science is a very good thing. But he does note this growth in power over nature, and he notes something else, and we'll come to this when we read it, because we are going to read De Descriptione Temporum, that lecture he gave when he began as the Cambridge professor of medieval and Renaissance literature, that come the mid-19th century, a shift takes place. He's going to talk about in the Abolition of Man as well. There's a shift from the power over nature to the power over man. And with this, the arising of new disciplines, which in English we describe as the social sciences. Psychology, anthropology, sociology, religious studies, almost everything that has studies behind it. These are new disciplines, actually. They don't exist in the universities before this. With them is obviously a look at the traditional subject of university study, but it's taking a different vantage point and with a different purpose. The different purpose is that which B.F. Skinner describes. It's to try and take control of things, to get rid of the literature of freedom and dignity, to get rid of the idea of human freedom and human dignity in order to, because these are obstacles to taking full control and making things genuinely better as Skinner sees it. So we got to get rid of this, these old-fashioned beliefs about virtue and such things, and human dignity and human freedom. Got to see the human being as a species of animal, obviously an evolved one, a superior one, but still nonetheless as an animal. But the other thing about this, and this is really interesting, and it's in Lewis's own fiction, magic appears alongside science. So think about in The Magician's Nephew, Uncle Andrew's a scientist, but he's really interested. He's got these magical rings, and he's obsessed with what they might deliver to him. And in that Hideous Strength, which we're not reading here, I do this in the Sci-Fi Subcreation course. I don't want to overlap here because I wanted to deal with more of Lewis's work, not overlap there. That way you get to do even more of his stuff. But in That Hideous Strength, the National Institute of Coordinated Experiments, the NICE, it craves the powers of science and magic. So it really wants to find Merlin, because it's going to deliver them the same thing. So these are themes in Lewis's works. There's a lust in the scientist for power. It's a common feature of his fiction and his imaginative universe. He sees it in evolutionism as well, to some degree, and also in Freudianism, which he also calls bulverism. I'll hopefully come to that. So note here, Lewis this is not an anti-science position. It's a certain type of science that he's disputing. He's thankful for the scientists. In fact, he says that the reason that the scientists, and there's a difference between science and magic as well. Science works. And why does it work? Because science is based on the way things actually are. That's why it functions. It acts in accordance with the laws of nature as God created it. It observes what God has done, how it functions, and therefore we get to live in that sort of lucid light of the way things actually are, rather than the way we might imagine them to be. So modern science is intensely interested in that. But scientism, on the other hand, and this is his real target here, scientism tends towards controlling rather than investigating nature. And if you want to see that as its primary characteristic, then go all the way back to Bacon. Except the difference between Bacon and what comes afterwards is this turn to see mankind as part of the nature to be controlled. And so we become more and more dependent on the scientists and on technological devices and the ordering of life and the planning of life. So there are similarities there, but there are also differences. But the commonality is that both in magic and in science, and modern science in the scientism sense, there is this latent desire to have power over nature, and specifically over human nature, to control people, to condition them, in the belief that it's for everyone's good. This is again, what I said at the outset, at the same time he observes this sort of this hidden delight in tormenting other people, which is positively satanic. It's portrayed as such in Perelandra. The devil in that tears apart frogs. He just kills them. He's ripping them apart. And the purpose of it, there is no purpose. He doesn't even seem, it's just happening without any, it's just death. Not even a delight in killing per se. Why do people watch blood sports? They delight in cruelty. All, by the way, even those who want to ban them. Maybe they want to ban them because there's a secret awareness of how horrible that is, but you can't abolish the problem by abolishing the practice, even if you might want to. The problem lies within. All right? Anyway, 3 ways in which the science and religion are similar, and I'm going to comment on those. And this is a little summary by a man by the name of John G. West. It's in a collection of essays about the abolition of man, but the title of the book is The Magician's Twin. So the book by Lewis is The Magician's Nephew, right? The first in the Narnia trilogy. But The Magician's Twin, by that he means science, or science in its modern guise as scientism, as the use of this endeavor that we call science in order to gain power. But it has 3 features which are much like magic. What are they? Well, one, it has a religious feature. Science is almost a religion. In fact, he's going to argue, and I will argue, that one of the reasons people find Christianity, and it's not a popular religion in our day, is it's utterly at odds with the religion of our day, which is scientism. Where's the power lie? If you look at the world around you, it looks like the power lies in science, right? People believe in power. God will have power. This God has power. People believe in their gods. Their gods are powerful. They're going to deliver certain things. Science is delivering a lot of things. Note that the faith, as we speak, in terms of conversions to Christianity, it takes place in countries where the faithful have no power. It's Iran, where it's exploding. China. They're not deluded like we are that we actually have power. That's the difference, by the way. It's not because they're poor, it's because they have no delusions about the nature of the way the world is. Common question.
So what are we saying this religious feature consists of?
Well, okay, I'm coming to that. So thank you for the question. Yeah, what does it consist of? Well, first of all, it presents an aura of mystery and awe. And even wonder. It allows us to do things beyond our normal human capacities. Why are there stores? Apple stores every time the new device comes out. Why are there lines going around the corners? Like, what's with that? You can see it in popular fiction as well. Star Wars, again, this is West's example. Star Wars, Lord of the Rings, Narnia Chronicles, Harry Potter. The works of our very own authors. Is there a difference between Star Wars, Narnia, Harry Potter, whatever, in the popular imagination? No, they reduce them all to the same thing, actually. And you can throw in Game of Thrones with that, probably. They're all more or less the same sort of thing. Now, Christopher Tolkien was outraged at this fact. But they've effectively presented his father's corpus of work as more or less saying the same sort of thing with the same sort of features as all of the things that he would have regarded as antithetical to his vision. So there are magic stories, and there are mysterious creatures, and they have powers, and it's an imaginative world. And these have food there for the Christian, and they also have food there for the totally anti-religious. They find these things appealing and attractive. In fact, I believe that people who like science fiction that go to the fairs and so forth, they're often extremely anti-religious in terms of how they would describe themselves. But actually, in terms of what moves them, I would say it's the exact opposite. That's not what moves them. It is that religious experience, and they are full on into it. They're wearing the costumes and all that sort of stuff. Like, they're really on board with that. In Lewis's lifetime, it was the fiction of H.G. Wells, of which we read one of his novels in the sci-fi subcreation work, The War of the World, or the First Men in the Moon. But if you read any of his novels now, they sound like a description of the contemporary. The themes that fire his imagination are the same themes that are popular in our day. The Island of Dr. Moreau has human beings being bred with other animals and so forth. So there's these hybrid creatures, chimeras. I mentioned the time machine, this transportation in the future and so forth, where things have been devastated. The War of the Worlds, popularly known. The invisible man. It's looking at things through the lens of power, looking at life and the possibilities that, and where would this go? Darwin's theory of evolution as a cosmic creation story, Lewis gave various terms for this. So if you read his works, sometimes he calls it the scientific outlook. He doesn't mean it's science. It's the, quote, scientific outlook, or evolutionism. So he, by the way, he never dismisses evolution per se, because he's not a scientist, and he wants to argue that evolution needs to be considered, not just dismissed, because all theories need to be considered. So he's not just, we'll just leave it out there. Now, he doesn't believe in it, but he doesn't want to dismiss it per se. But evolutionism, the trappings of religious, the fervency of belief and so forth, that he debunks and disputes and ridicules all over the place. Likewise, he sometimes calls it the myth of evolutionism, and sometimes even Wellsianity. There he's most strongly connecting it with, so I get rid of this blue light, the idea of Wellesianity as a popular replacement of Christianity. And there's something there, I think. In a little essay he writes called Is Theology Poetry? He says this: everything seems to be against the infant hero of our dreams, just as everything seems against the youngest son or ill-used stepdaughter at the opening of a fairy tale. Doesn't matter. Life somehow wins. With infinite suffering against all but insuperable obstacles, it spreads, it breeds, it complicates itself from the amoeba up to the plane, up to the reptile, up to the animal. So there's this triumph of life over horrible obstacles, and yet towards the end of all that, tragedy strikes. And despite the progress over the insurmountable odds, which is the story of Star Wars, and is the story of Harry Potter, and it's the story of the Lord of the Rings, and it's the story of the Narnia Chronicles. It characterizes those things. What doesn't characterize them is the tragedy that strikes. There's some variations on that. In the time machine, the Earth is cooled. The Earth is obliterated. Scientists in our day project that the world will end through heat death, climate change alarmists, and so forth. But in the time machine, and I'll quote here, the darkness grew apace, a cold wind began to blow, from the edge of the sea came a ripple and a whisper, beyond those lifeless sounds the world was silent, all the sounds of man, the bleating of sheep, the cries of birds, the hum of insects, the stir that makes the background of our lives, all that was over. And Lewis thinks that this is the greatest myth of all. So he doesn't, when he says that it's a myth, he doesn't dispute it because he thinks it's ridiculous. He says that this is the most glorious of all myths. And he says it's characteristic of the Norse sagas as well. The Götterdämmerung, the cataclysmic end of all things. It will end in global disaster, famine, hunger, apocalypse, and so forth. That's characteristic of certain types of myths and the ones that he most loves. And so he loves this myth. And in a little essay called The Funeral of a Great Myth, which I spoke on at this apologetics conference, he says that he grew up believing in this myth and he feels it's perfect grandeur, or almost perfect grandeur. And he says, let no one say we are in an unimaginative age. Neither the Greeks nor the Norsemen ever invented a better story. Even now, he says, in certain moods I could almost find it in my heart to wish that it was not mythical, but true. Nonetheless, it's a myth. There's no basis for it whatsoever, other than the fact that the story is so compelling. People think, well, it can't be because it's not a happy ending. Yes, but the best stories, the most compelling, are not happy endings. The holding together against the odds, against all odds, and yet triumphing in the end, that actually doesn't characterize the best stories. In The Lord of the Rings, Sauron the Great is overthrown by Frodo at the cost of Frodo's life. Frodo cannot stay. He's going to die. But at the end of it all, the evil that he brought about is not gone. It perdures. It carries on. It lingers. And the next time it will be more powerful. And Gandalf says that one day it will overcome the good. There's no victory in the future. We might be able to prevail now, but inevitably evil will win. And that's important because if you watch the movie versions, it's a Hollywood ending, right? The evil's all gone. There's no evil left. Well, read the Tolkien's works, and that's not the case. Simply not the case. Evil persists, and it will come back in another form, even more wicked. Now will be the age of men, he says. So this is these fantastic beasts in which men were some alongside them. Now it's just the age of men, in other words, our own age. And then wickedness will come. And it will win. Now what it doesn't do is articulate what Tolkien himself believed, which is that in the victory of evil, God will triumph at the cross, right? But that's for another course. But the point is that that story, when in its original version, in its real version, has the victory is no real victory. You need to recognize that. The one that's a little less like that is actually Narnia. And that's more closely approximating the Christian narrative of the second coming and going further up and further in and so forth. But we'll come to that. But note how much Tolkien is like these other myths of great triumph, and yet in the midst of all that, a terrible defeat, which is looming and is inevitable. And he just thinks that this is magnificent. And so Lewis thinks that biology after Darwin provides the fuel for turning science into a popular religion. It's not because of the inevitable progress, right? So we are what we are now, and we're going to progress towards something else. It's the idea that this is a destructive enterprise, and it's going to ruin us all to believe this thing, which it does, by the way, in certain respects. But that's the most glorious part of it. Its inherent destructiveness. Why did the Nazis believe in social Darwinism? And then Hitler, when the Nazis wouldn't follow his orders without failure, he committed his own troops to destruction. He said the German people deserve to be destroyed for not listening to my orders. It's a nihilism, self-destructiveness that is a part of it. It's part of the grand vision that is supposedly a part of science, but is in Lewis's rendition is actually instigated by dark powers. So there's a demonic use of this lust for power. So it's not the flesh and blood scientists that are the problem, it's the dark powers that are motivating this lust for power, which is impossible because it's God's own prerogative to have dominion over all the earth. We're to do it under his rule and reign, not on our own. So there's deceit that is going on in all of that. So science as a religion, he traces that aspect. Another aspect of it is simply the credulity that goes with scientism. Stunning lack of skepticism about what the scientists say. So somebody will say, 97% of the scientists say this, so therefore this is what science says. Hopefully if you've done any logic here, any philosophy classes, you will not accept that stupid assertion. It doesn't matter if 100% say it is. That doesn't mean it is so. But in general, he says that our age, despite being scientific per se, is stunningly lacking in skepticism in a sense of rational questioning of assertions. So I'll quote West here, and he quotes Dawkins, Richard Dawkins. He says, science is based upon verifiable evidence, while religious faith, and then in brackets, West writes, which Dawkins views as a kind of magic, quote, not only lacks evidence, its independence from evidence is its pride and joy. So the fact that it lacks any evidence is precisely, says Dawkins, what Christians most take pride in. That it's just by faith, blind faith, faith without any evidence. I would say that that is exactly what Lewis is describing of beliefs in scientism. It's blind faith, and they hold it most strongly when the evidence goes against them. What is a good example of this? Gender identity is a terrific example of credulity in modern science and what it says. Note that, and this is the thing that most alarmed Jordan Peterson, gender identity and the assertion of gender identity has no correlation with any observable empirical characteristic. None. That's part of it. It's purely self-declared. But there's no empirical basis whatsoever other than the pure assertion. So it's not verifiable thing at all. And therefore it's held more strongly. And note that in terms of our popular culture, the belief that we must affirm this has a fervency and a pressure which marks it not only as a religious point of view, but as blind belief in what the scientists tell us is scientific, even though it doesn't fit the criteria of science. So we're in an age marked by credulity. I would say a less well-founded, but a similar assertion is about anthropogenic global warming. But the best test case is gender identity, because it contradicts. It does not allow verification, in fact. That's the point. It's impossible to verify. I am this because I say I am. And the scientific community, the social scientists say we have to affirm this. We have to say that we believe that you are whatever you assert you are, because that will be affirming the reality. And that's the reality. This is a claim made by the scientists, the social scientists, the psychologists, despite the obvious harm in many cases. And the studies manifestly demonstrating that there is no benefit to the individuals to whom you affirm this either. Like, so if suicide is the danger, suicide rates don't decline when people are affirmed in their gender identity. They stay more or less the same, if not increase in certain cases. Even when they have the surgery, it doesn't reduce the harming. And yet, it's to be affirmed. Bill C-16, which is in Canada right now, as a law. It's supposed to be empirically, there's a commission that's verifying this, the results and the effectiveness of the new measures in combating it, but the measures have never been publicly revealed. That was back in 2016. Where's the public demonstration of whether the new measures of affirming are actually being effective in combating the distresses that some people feel from confusion about their gender identity? Where is it? Why isn't anybody asking the question? Credulity, fear. In the age of magic, the claims of the witch doctor were accepted without contradiction. In the age of science, almost anything can be taken seriously only if it is defended in the name of science. That's the credulity that he's talking about. In That Hideous Strength, there's a sociologist at the sort of center of his name is Mark Studdick. And he doubts, and he's there because he's a good writer, not because he's a good sociologist. He thinks sociology is the business. The NIC doesn't care about his sociology. They like the fact that he's a gifted writer. And he finds this sort of repugnant because it suggests the ongoing power of the arts and not the sciences. But never mind. Studdick doubts whether they can propagandize educated people, because he's aware that they're asking him to do propaganda. He says, we can't pull this off with educated people. And the head of its police force, whose name is Fairy Hardcastle, sort of Dickensian names, she says this: "Why, you fool, it's the educated reader who can be gulled. All our difficulty comes with the others. When did you meet a workman who believes the papers? He takes it for granted that they're all propaganda and skips the leading articles. We have to recondition him. That is the working man who won't believe what he's being told by those who are in authority. That's the guy we have to go after. But the educated public, the people who read the highbrow weeklies, they don't need reconditioning. They're all right already. They'll believe anything. Why? Because they think that they're smart. And so they couldn't possibly be hoodwinked, right? They're in the in crowd. And they look down on those that aren't with them on this. But they're as gullible as can be. They're the most. So the most educated are the most credulous. And the leading examples are their Freudianism and Evolutionism. I'm going to skip over that large part. But in The Funeral of a Great Myth, He goes after evolutionism, if you're interested. In an essay called Bulverism, he goes after Freudianism. So if you want to look at that yourself, by all means go there, but that's where he describes those things. The final component is the most important one of all, and to me, to some degree, it explains how the educated are the most credulous. It's because power comes with it. Science, this view of science is going to give power, and who's it going to give power to? It's going to give power to the elite. And they see themselves as part of that elite. So this is a tribalism. Do the educated of Silicon Valley send their kids to public schools? Do the educated of Silicon Valley allow their children to have smartphones and iPads and so forth? Do they allow them to have it? And the answer is no in both cases. They send them to places where they're not going to be subject to the conditioning which they think is a good thing. It's a good thing for them, for other people to be like that. It's not a good thing to apply to themselves. So the credulity, the belief in this, and almost a religious fervor to it, delivers power. So that's the most important one, and I'm going to spend the rest of the time talking about this. But as again, science actually works, so it does deliver a sort of power, whereas magic doesn't do that. But it's still, in both cases, people are prone towards delving in magic because of the secret power that it might deliver. So there's all sorts of, around Toronto, there are palm readers and so forth popping up all over the place. You've seen them, tarot card readers, like all over, like every strip mall seems to have one, along with places where you can get a massage, you know. In case you're not aware, you're not getting only a massage there, just, right? The aspect of science that is potent in a way that magic isn't is that it offers hope of an earthly salvation through the limitless human ingenuity. So new technological devices, I talked about the Apple's phones or whatever, and the lines around the thing. This is technological salvation. Why do we believe in progress? Because it's salvation from the imminent destruction which we believe is coming. We might be saved through this. And there's clear power in it. Say I'm recording this, and I'll flip it up onto the internet in a little while, and it can be seen anywhere around the globe. That's extraordinary. Could even have been done simultaneously. Like, it's power of the internet. It's like the seeing stones in Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. Note that the seeing stones don't see everything, but they allow the belief in domination. They allow you to think that what you see is inevitable, because they don't allow you to see the distance of history, perspective, and so forth. So Tolkien is utilizing the problem of technology while also questioning how wise, and you have to be wise in order to use it. Note that he says that it's not ipso facto evil, but you need the power of strength of character and the wisdom to use it. And some have that, but not many, and most ought not to. But this is the deliverance of scientism, or the claim of belief of deliverance in scientism. But Lewis isn't buying it. So in his view, and this is where we're going to get the abolition of man now, the scientific utopians fail to account the moral vacuum at the heart now of the human race, which has been brought about by their own view of education. So the people who will be wielding this power of technology lack the character and moral fiber to be able to wield it. So he's not anti-science, per se. quote, "It might be going too far to say that the modern scientific movement was tainted from its birth, but I think it would be true to say that it was born in an unhealthy neighborhood and at an inauspicious hour." Why an unhealthy neighborhood and an inauspicious hour? Because of the decline in belief in the Christian religion. Lewis says that modern people are even more benighted than the pagans were, because the pagans at least acknowledged the Tao. They had moral fiber. We educate people, as he concluded, the men without chests, to have no resistance to anything. They're not supposed to resist. They're supposed to indulge, consume. And yet they're given great power. It's like being given put behind the wheel of a Ferrari when you're a 5-year-old. Can't possibly control the car, let alone know the consequences of doing things. You can't see moral consequences. In modern gender ideology, to turn back to this, it's you're being informed about this for the purposes of consent. Right? The consent-based sex ed curriculum is so that children are being taught to learn what consent means, so they no means no and stuff like that. Consent is a legal definition, by the way. There's such a thing called an age of consent. It's when you have, when you're an adult and you have a sense of moral awareness. That's when you're so-called age of consent, sexually I'm speaking. Why do you teach it to a 6-year-old if it's 16, if sexual actions below a certain threshold are not even considered? You're not capable of giving consent. How is that possible? Why would you teach people about certain sexual activities as consent when you're not able to consent? So you can consent to know what yes and no means, but you can't consent to understand what consent actually entails. What would be the purpose of doing such a thing? Conditioning. I answer my own question. Some call it grooming. For some, it might be grooming. I think the larger imperative for many is simply the scientific imperative of gaining power over the human frame. Get it at an early age as well. If you read Brave New World by Aldous Huxley, he talks about prenatal conditioning. Got to get them young. Get them before they're born. Eugenics movement. It's the same thing. It's gaining power over human nature. You do it really early. You cut out the unwanted things so you can do it right from the inception before the problems occur. So they don't take into account the moral vacuum, these utopias at the heart of contemporary science. And furthermore, further problem, as soon as we take the final step of reducing our own species to the level of mere nature, this is a direct quote from The Abolition of Man, the whole process is stultified. For this time, the being who stood to gain and the being who has been sacrificed are one and the same. There's the problem. You have to treat yourself as an object in order to gain power over the object. So you kill yourself in the process of gaining this power over yourself. People who are caught up in addictions, of which we all are to some degree, because we are conditioned beings. Conditioning wouldn't work if we weren't conditioned beings. If we weren't, wasn't an aspect of human nature which was subject to conditioning. It would never work at all, but it does work. People who are caught up in this, the one thing they most lose is they lose a sense of moral worth. They get humiliated by their condition. And to me, this is the aspect of gender identity as well. I want you to affirm it. Why would I affirm that? Because it's good for the people that you're affirming it. It actually doesn't do anything for them, by the way. But what it does is it humiliates you who affirms it. Removes that last little vestige of the chest that you don't have, right? And studies of totalitarian regimes demonstrate that this is what they try and do. They get people to do ridiculous acts. So in the Men Without, no, not Men Without Chest, the what's the third installment of That Hideous Strength? He gets Studdock to stamp on a crucifix. That's what he wants him to do, and he won't do it. He can't do it for some reason. He's not religious at all, but he can't do it. He thinks there's something wrong with it, and he doesn't even have any belief per se, but he thinks there's something wrong with it, and he won't do it because he thinks it's wrong. It doesn't even matter why it's wrong. He doesn't need to know that, but the simple fact that he does it, he won't do it because it's wrong, is sufficient to break the spell that he's under. As soon as somebody does something because it's right or because it's wrong, they are breaking the control of the conditioners. They're affirming the Tao, which is always there. It's just that the Tao can be strengthened or weakened, but it can't be abolished. And the purpose of education is to strengthen it, because it enables people to be self-governing. This is the thing about dominion. The first dominion you need is dominion over yourself. You can't help other people if you're not in control of yourself. That's what adults are supposed to do. They're supposed to be responsible, and they're helping you to be responsible. By treating human beings as the products of blind, non-rational forces, scientific reductionism eliminates man as a rational moral agent. It eliminates. That was the thesis of B.F. Skinner, Beyond Freedom and Dignity. It eliminates the idea of mankind as a rational moral agent. It disputes rationality and it disputes morality. As I say, Darwinism is self-refuting because it's a species of materialism. Now, Lewis is worried that this reductionist view of the human person will open the door to widespread manipulation of human beings. And I quote, "If man chooses to treat himself as raw material he will be. Not raw material to be manipulated, as he fondly imagined, by himself, but by mere appetite, that is, mere nature, in the person of his dehumanized conditioners, who are similarly dehumanized. They're similarly being motivated by the dark horse of they're doing it out of the desire to do what? Torture. Or do whatever they want, but they're motivated by appetites. There's no rational reason why you would do this to people. And they're blind to their own motivations on this. Lewis is not, by the way, throwing even the scientists who do such things, he doesn't throw them entirely under the bus. So look at the portrait of Weston in Perelandra. There's something good in Weston. The good in Weston, which the beasts in the Out of the Silent Planet recognize, the Oyarsa, is he actually wants, there's some good that he wants to preserve. He wants to preserve life. That's a good thing, Oyarsa says. I can do something with this guy. Because he has a good motivation. It's a good moral motivation. I can work with that. Whereas divine has no moral motivation. He wants gold. Son's blood. That's what the inhabitants call it. That's what he's there for. I can't do anything with him. If he were my creature, I would just wipe him out. But this one I would rehabilitate. Weston, the scientist. So the scientists are not more wicked than anyone else. They just have more power and they have the opportunity, and they bear the same wicked human nature that everyone in this room does. And so he's very worried about that if there are no effective limits on human manipulation, then the problem is that there's no obstruction to the aims of scientism. It undermines the authority of the very ethical principles needed to justify the limits. Because it's the appeal to moral constraint that will justify the constraining. So old rules, like a man has no right to play God. You ever heard that? Well, we mustn't play God. It's the premise behind Frankenstein. Early 19th century literature, early science fiction literature, early horror fiction. It's all of those three things, by the way. It's the best example. It's also the best example of the Gothic novel. in many ways. All of those things, really interesting work. And the premise behind it is that it is man ought not to play God. Do we see that same moral belief in our contemporaries? Lewis would say the danger of scientism is it will remove even that. Punishment ought to be proportionate to the crime. Another basic moral belief represented in an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Code of Hammurabi, Babylonian king, all the way back there, articulated in scriptures furthermore. Right? So the punishment for premeditated murder, first degree murder as we call it, is a life. Doesn't mean you can kill somebody who's committed murder. There has to be a trial and so forth in the process and all that. So it's not vengeance, it's justice. But it's proportionate justice. It's proportionate to the crime in order to demonstrate in the law what justice actually is. And if you ignore that, then you get rid of justice. That was his defense of capital punishment. That's exactly the reason. And he goes on to say the reason why we would do this is because if we don't do that, there will be limitless punishment for crime. There will be no limit to it. If we don't recognize proportionate limit, there is no limit. So you'll have to be conditioned the rest of your life. You'll always be under supervision. You're being watched. You'll never be free. Like your time is up. You've served your sentence. You've paid for what you did in the past. You're now free from the crime you committed. No, you're never free from it under the conditioners. Orwell portrays it as thought crime. And you're never allowed freedom. That's his concern. It's Orwell's concern as well. So this is what he's talking about in The Abolition of Man, is the consequence of a certain educational philosophy, an educational philosophy which is common to the social sciences, common to Freudianism and common to Darwinianism. He describes this all over the place. Now let me go to a final component of this. Comments or questions at this point before I do that. Because I throw a lot at you this class, I know I do, and I'm sorry for that, sort of. Because that's what the lecture is for. I mean, you can read the book yourself. I'm sort of connecting things and trying to give you a bigger picture. A big picture which will comprehend the rest of the works, because the man Lewis doesn't write, I mean, he does write these different genres. Some of it we call apologetics, some of it we call literary theory, some of it we call fiction, etc., etc. Well, what unites those things besides the man Lewis? Well, the convictions that he holds that are expressed in all of them at all times. And if you don't have the big picture, you don't really get the man, even when you seem to get him. He seems to be making a different argument than the one he's actually making. So science that is characterized by principles and practices that tend towards control rather than investigating nature, he calls scientism. So that's that lust for power and control. That's the feature. Rather than investigating nature, he thinks is wonderful. That's a Christian pursuit. The early scientists were Christians. To this day, many remain Christians, by the way. But the climate that they're involved in is the research industry. And they need to have results. And the results have to be proved in order to justify the expenditures. And the expenditures come from where? The public purse. In other words, the taxes. Why is the taxpayer interested in scientific progress in the terms of power? Who's going to get the power? Is it the scientists? No, they'll just get more grant money. Who will get power? The powerful will get power. Humanity will get power. Well, who's the humanity? The humanity they're gaining power over is the humanity that they're violating. Like, what would be the ethical limit? The other thing that's alarming, and you will know this because it's become widely publicized, a lot of scientific or social scientific studies are now, even classic ones, are being demonstrated to be unverifiable. How did it take so long to figure that one out? Did nobody check at the time? And why didn't they check at the time? Why are those classical studies, which are called classical studies, considered classical studies? Because they happen to be related to an area of moral resistance that the experiment suggests is invalid, and further justifying the area of study. But Lewis warns in this third lecture, The Abolition of Man, that if any one age really attains by eugenics and scientific education — note that eugenics, by the way, is happening in England while he speaks, and in Canada while he speaks, including under the great Tommy Douglas, the founding of Canada's healthcare system, the NDP leader, was involved in eugenics experiments, happening in Quebec as well. Usually on orphans, by the way, people who are vulnerable. Happening also in Nazi Germany. Well, we blame the Nazis for it. They were doing eugenics. Horrible people. It was considered a war crime after the Second World War, eugenics. Nowadays, it's not a war crime because, of course, we're better than the Nazis. Right? You're not a Nazi, are you? It's the worst thing I could call you. How are you not a Nazi? The Nazis believed in the religion of science. They were very credulous about it, and they believed above all the power that would come to them, their master race. They were doing it for humanity. They were humanitarians. They were just expediting Darwin's thesis, which is just scientific. He says, if any one age really attains by eugenics and scientific education the power to make its descendants what it pleases, all men who live after it are the patients of that power. The word patient here is quite appropriate. If you think about a patient on a table, but patient comes from the Latin word to suffer. They will suffer the power. There are certain people who do the enacting of it, and there are people who suffer it. And we suffer from it. So why? Explanation. Why are people prone to anxiety and depression in our day, and a variety of mental illnesses in a way that they weren't in foregoing ages? Because they are on a scale that was not the case when I went through school. How come? How come so many patients? Is it because of the immoral education to which they've been inflicted, and the fact that they've not been given the moral resistance inbuilt to fight back, or they've been discouraged into thinking they have the power within them to do so? I think that's a big part of it. If you want somebody to be depressed, let them think they have no control over their lives. It's easier to do when somebody's in a broken family. Suffered a tragedy, it's very easy. You can break anyone, actually, but some people are a little bit more vulnerable. But he says, far from being freer and better humans, these new creatures will be weaker, not stronger. For though we may have put wonderful machines in their hands, which we carry around in our hands, we have preordained how they are to use them. So you got this great power. What are you going to do with it? What are you going to do what you're told to do with it? How is that freedom? As a result of sophisticated biotechnology, even further, quote, man's conquest of nature, if the dreams of some scientific planners are realized, means the rule of a few hundreds of men over billions upon billions of men. The final stages come when man, by eugenics, by prenatal conditioning, which Aldous Huxley is writing about in fictional works of his day, and by education and propaganda based on a perfect applied psychology, has obtained full control over himself. Human nature will be the very last part of nature to surrender to man. The battle will have been won. So that's where I'm going to conclude it to some degree. Has the battle been won? Well, if it has, then we're in the era of posthumanism. It's a literary theory in our day, posthumanism, by the way. Posthumanism, just to give you a sense of what it is, without getting too far in it, I'll get a couple definitions. Transhumanism is the attempt to use technology to perfect human nature, to augment it. It recognizes that there is a human nature. Like there's a nature to human nature. And you try and make it better. Education to some degree has always been involved in that. That's also called humanism. Try and make a human being more fully human. Transhumanism is to add a little technology to that. So I can add, when I was a kid in the 70s, the bionic man, Steve Austin, an astronaut, man barely alive. We can rebuild him. That was the lead-in. I remember the words exactly. And then he was given bionic limbs, and he could run like super, like the Flash, right? And he had these prosthetic limbs, but he was a cyborg basically. That's transhumanism. He was still a human being, though. There was nothing unhuman about him. He just had more power. All the modern comic book heroes are sort of like that, right? And what's with the interest in them, by the way? Same sort of thing. Posthumanism is different. Posthumanism regards what we call the humanum to be no different in any respect on a moral level or an essential level from the animal world, or even from the technological world, or even the rest of nature. So there's no difference at all. So posthumanism is the movement in our day, which is very prominent in eco-criticism, that man is in fact no different than any other thing. And not only animals, but even machines. So we ought to have rights for computers and not just human beings. Because what's with the speciesism? The privileging of the human being as an entity. Why ought we to do that? And their answer is we ought not to. We ought to be able to perfect it. Now, if you think that this is a arcane or marginal field of pursuit, it's at the University of Oxford. It's in California. It's at the leading technological universities in the world. University of Toronto, also the Mars Institute there. You ever gone by that big building? MARS. It's almost like an NICE in its designation. It's got that wonderful acronym. All of these places, and there's a fellow by the name of Julian Savulescu. Look him up. He's post-humanist. And he wants to condition human nature to prevent ethical. So there's a belief that we need to give over power to the scientists to eradicate the ills of human nature. And the ills of human nature right now, as you know, because you're being given the awareness of it all around you, is that we're going to destroy the earth and make it warmer. In order to prevent that from happening, we have to give over power over our lives and control of the lives to prevent that. Well, that's a species of posthumanism, defending the earth from mankind. Mankind seen as a virus. And at the very least, to have no different status than the natural world that it allegedly protects. Very popular with David Suzuki. It's a religious perspective. It's a scientism. Lewis is talking about it in his fiction. And he's talking about it certainly in The Abolition of Man. When he talked about it, it was an imminent threat. In our day, I wonder whether he's correct, whether the battle has been won. My answer to that is no, it has not been won. It has not, and it cannot win. It's not possible. On the other hand, it can attain great power, and people can suffer horribly for it. But that's what Lewis is talking about in The Abolition of Man. Now, that's going to pervade his whole corpus of work. So, when you read Narnia as a kid and you like Aslan because Aslan's like Jesus, that's an aspect of his work. But boy, that's only a smidgen of the whole corpus. It really, he's dealing with larger issues than that all the time. Some of them are philosophically quite brilliant. And we will get to those. But the largest thrust is this assault on human nature, I think, which is at the heart of all the other ones. And that's why I started the course with it. So next time, we're going to go back we've fleshed out where we're eventually going to end up, but then we're going to now take a backtrack and look at the discarded image and look at the world as it was before this set in. Okay, so we'll spend 3 lectures on that. And roughly I'll divide the book in 3. I'm not sure exactly where I'm going to leave off. We'll find out when the class happens. Okay, so